This module we're going to be doing things a little bit differently, and instead of having 4 different exercises where I'm going to be introducing a different technique or a different style or a different artist at the beginning of each of those exercises, I'm actually only going to be introducing this one particular exercise once, because we're going to be looking at op artists and we're going to be working on an exercise that has multiple steps. So instead of me talking about the same artist and the same technique 3 times before each of these different steps, I'm just going to do it for this one time. So what we're going to be doing for this exercise is we're going to be using Illustrator, a vector-based program, to create a visual that is inspired by the op artists. And this is a piece by Bridget Riley, who is probably one of the pioneers of the op art movement, and that started in the early to mid 60s, mostly in the UK. So not to be confused with pop art, which also started around then. This is op art, and the idea behind op art is that they were using specific geometries and measurements, and it was mostly shape-based, and they were using these different transformations within these shapes to create a sense of an optical illusion. Most of the time it's this idea of creating this sense of depth, and also in other examples I'm going to show in a little bit, some sense of movement with these different shapes and applying these different changes and abstractions in geometry to these shapes. And so the reason why we're using Illustrator to work with these visuals is because Illustrator is really geared towards having specific control of multiple components of an image. And so part of this is because of the vector file format that Illustrator works in. Instead of looking at pixels and treating all pixels the same, which is what Photoshop does, Illustrator works with vectors, and so every visual component that you see within your artboard in Illustrator is actually seen as an independent object by Illustrator. So you can have a bunch of different shapes, and you can have a bunch of different lines, and you can have, or brush strokes even, and even just points. And each of those little visual components, each of those little details is treated by Illustrator as its own independent object. So Illustrator can then apply different effects, different visual properties to each of those objects, so it gives you a lot more control over all the different components of your image. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in another video, so don't worry about if you're not getting it right now, don't worry. But what the biggest reason why we're using Illustrator for this project and for this exercise and working with op art is because Illustrator allows you to create very specific measurements. It allows you to create shapes that have specific measurements. It allows you to do things like make align shapes based on their position within the canvas and also based on their position to one another. It allows you to create duplicates of different objects, and even while you're duplicating them, you can still have control over each of those different duplicate copies you make. So you have a lot more control. You're able to use specific measurements. You're able to do things like align, lay things out on a grid, and these are all things that are a little bit harder to do in Photoshop. So let's go back to op art now. So what you're seeing here, this is one of the pieces done by Bridget Riley, and this is one of her more well-known works. I mean, she's a very well-known artist. She started off as a graphic designer and then began painting and then started producing these types of works in the mid-60s, and then continued to develop these works visually and in terms of adding more color and doing different things with the shapes, and she still is producing work now. So she is a very well-known artist, and that's another reason why we're focusing primarily on her. So I wanted to show some of these works and just so people can have an understanding of what we can now use digital tools to do that she had to do by hand back in the 1960s. So this is one of her more famous works, and I think it's called Hesitate, and it was done in 1964 or 1965. But I wanted to show this sketch here. So this is what she would have to start with before producing these large-scale works. So these finished paintings are done on hardboard, not cardboard, that is relatively large, so a couple of meters or a couple yards by a couple yards. So these are all big wall paintings. But she would always start with a smaller sketch in order to get all these different measurements and all these different details. So in order to achieve the optical illusions that she was going for, she had to make very precise measurements and very precise distortions with these different shapes. So not only was she having to be very precise with her starting shapes, so she had to make perfect circles. So she was using compasses or grids that she was laying out. She also then had to be very specific with how they were slowly distorting. So in this example, she's using a grid that's slowly vertically compressing and then using that grid to define the shape of the circles. And this is all very precise measurements that she was having to do by hand and with different measurement tools and drawing tools. And now we can use Illustrator to do these digitally. So definitely wanting to take advantage of the different affordances that Illustrator offers. So this is another example of this abstraction, this optical illusion. She's using the waveforms here to create a sense of depth and also a sense of movement that is, I think, a little bit more apparent in something like this. This is called Blaze. I think it's a great name, and this is probably making your monitor freak out. It's also making mine. I'm viewing this and it's doing some weird things to my eyes. So with this one though, you have not only a sense of movement with these, with that contrast that's being achieved with the black and the white next to each other, and also the form that it's taking on, but it's also creating a sense of depth. So you have a kind of a double optical illusion here. This is a little bit more subtle, but again, very, very refined, very, very planned out in terms of having to first do a horizontal compression on these outer edges, and then slowly transition that to just the regular or a more non-abstract circle, and then bringing that into more of a vertical compression as it comes to the center. So overall, this is creating this sense of this bulge that's happening, but it's very, very subtle. And she's also working with colors here in a very controlled way. And that's another thing that you can use Illustrator to do. So it can control color, and you can apply color in a very detailed way to the different visual parts of your image, or different visual components of your image. Oh, there's my background. So this is another a little less subtle piece that is creating that sense of depth and also that sense of movement with the lines. And we're going to be seeing how we can use Illustrator to take one shape and apply a distortion to it, and then quickly duplicate that shape in order to create almost a field of this type of abstraction and this visual effect. So this is a little bit more of a formal abstraction. It's not necessarily working with a field, but it's almost taking that abstraction and creating a sense of a larger object or shape. But these are still using these different, very specific geometries, very specific shapes, and these units of measure. And for instance, these angles, these all have to be the same. And using all of these different strategies in order to create this optical illusion. And this is another sketch that shows just, so these are protracted outlines here, and then she's using those to develop these curves, but then it's also on top of this grid, which she's using to define the overall shape of this form. And I was just talking about angles for this last one, but then you see here, as this is going down, all of those horizontal lines are having to maintain the same angle for every single step. So these are very specific measurements, very, very difficult to do by hand. And with things like vector programs and Illustrator, they're a little bit easier to do now with these different digital tools. So this is, again, a little bit more of a form versus a field of abstraction, but you still get that really interesting optical effect. Another sketch. Another form, abstractive form. And then to kind of end with these images, I just wanted to show a few of the artists behind these works that we're going to be looking at for this exercise. So the last step of this introduction before you go on to working with the exercise is to choose an image, one of these works, to to inspire what you're going to be doing and the visuals you're going to be creating for this exercise. So I want to, let me go back to this first one. I just want to clarify with that, I'm not looking for people to reproduce, shape by shape these different paintings, and I'm really just looking for people to pull different elements of abstraction from them. So, or pull different visual components and inspiration from them. So maybe you're going to use this as your inspiration image, and then you're going to be working mostly with circles and using the circles and different abstractions of the circles or different transformations of the circles to create some sense of depth or movement. Or maybe you're just inspired by how she's able with this painting to create the sense of the painting kind of folding in and then folding out again. So that's more of the optical effect, overall optical effect that she's achieving. So maybe you're trying to use this as an inspiration, and you're trying to do this with maybe lines or squares or diamonds. So it doesn't have to be a direct copy. I'm not looking for you to completely reproduce something. I'm just wanting you to be able to pull out a couple of components that you're inspired by, and then trying to work with as you're creating your images for this exercise. So yeah, I think that's it for this introduction, and just take this time now to choose an inspiration image or images, and then get started with step 1.